Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of GDDV 100 Game Theory 1. My name is Kasanas. Guys, we are moving along pretty darn well. We've already covered a bunch of stuff. We've done our course intro, we talked about what is game, we discussed design thinking and several different methodologies, we talked about flow states, immersion, and feedback loops. So we are cruising along here, and this is great. Today, we're going to move on to the idea of narrative. All right, let's get started. So right now, I'm sure lots of you are thinking, I don't want to talk about narrative. Narrative has nothing to do with my game whatsoever. And I hope that your stance on that may have changed after several of the videos that we had here. We took a look at the idea of core mechanics in a previous video, and we talked about the idea of enveloping your mechanics one after the other, your core mechanic, your secondary mechanic, your progression mechanics, and your narrative mechanics. And narrative is what gives context to everything else, right? That gives a context to why your player is playing your game. If we take a look at the idea of top-down versus bottom-up methodologies that we spoke about earlier, you're right, narrative may play a lesser role in your game, but it's still involved within that particular methodology, right? If you are going from the bottom up, it's about player experience, and your player experiences the narrative as kind of an add-on afterwards where it kind of ties things together. If, however, you're top down, well, narrative is a very important part of your game. Narrative informs all of the mechanics of play, right? So narrative can play a larger or lesser extent within your game itself. I am suggesting that there is narrative in every game. Whether or not you're actively creating a narrative like a story-based game, or you are creating a puzzle game, I don't care what you're creating, there's narrative in there in some way, right? You may have visual narrative or visual elements that suggest story and underlying lore. That is the narrative of your story, right? Your players are creating that narrative in their own head. Even if you're not explicitly suggesting a narrative, you're not telling the story yourself, you are suggesting a narrative through the visual elements that you're creating or the sounds that you're creating within your game, right? Your players are building that narrative in their own head. So even if you're not a big narrative person, I'm suggesting that there's narrative in your game and that this particular episode could be still very important to you. So let's take a look at narrative. Narrative is the telling of a story or communication of a chain of events, fictional or real. Aspects of narrative include how the story is told, the context in which it is presented, and the construction of the story. So we're going to get into elements of a story and everything else as we move forward. But again, this reinforces what I'm suggesting, that how you're telling your story will still have a story involved, even if it's just through visual narrative that you're creating through your environment. Narrative is the telling of a story. That's what we said before. And it's important to understand the difference between narrative and story, right? There is a difference between narrative and story. And especially in today's political climate, I think it's actually important that we understand that narrative and story are two very different things. So let's explore that. Now, I'd also like to make sure that you understand that I don't consider myself to be a story. I'm a storyteller, but I don't consider myself to be a good narrative designer. That's not my forte. I can add it into my games, but narrative design is a very specific aspect of game, and you should have someone who's an expert in this looking at your game. If it's not your strong point, have someone look over your game. Anyway, let's go into this. What is narrative? They should probably say what is story, because that's what we're examining right now. The story of something is an objective sequence of events and actions which can be told from many different perspectives. And it's actually that many different perspectives that are the narratives. Any given story told from a different point of view or a different perspective is a narrative of that story, right? And obviously, there could be many, many different narratives of the same story. A great example is Kurosawa's Rashomon. If we take a look at that film, awesome film, it's all about a dead samurai, and the story is told 4 different times by a bandit, the samurai's wife, the dead samurai, and a woodcutter, and all of whom kind of claim the center point of their story. They are the protagonist. They are the hero of their individual view, right? And it's the exact same story told from 4 different points of view. So it's one story with 4 narratives. Go out and watch this film. I can't show a clip of it here. It's actually, I don't know how I'm going to do clips when it comes to the asynchronous portion of this, because I don't want to throw up a clip on here. Anyway, we'll have to come to that when we come to it. Go out and watch Rashomon, all right? So let's talk about the idea of the elements of story. All right. And the problem with this is in my research. Like I said, I'm not really a narrative. I'm not. It's not that I'm not a narrative person. I'm just not a narrative designer. There are people who are awesome at this. And in my research in teaching this particular lesson, I found that many of the experts suggest there are 5 to 8 different elements of story. Depending on the list you're looking at or the textbook you're reading, there are anywhere between 5 and 8 elements of story. And no two lists have any of these things agreed. I've actually found 11 different elements of story when I look at all the lists across the board. So without presenting any of them as, the right list, I'm going to show you the 11 elements of the story that I've identified. Okay? Theme is the central topic. It's what your book is actually about. It's the central topic of your book, this underlying idea. Plot is a sequence of events in a story. So how do things occur, how and what order they occur is the plot sequence. Setting, time and location of the narrative. Characters, those involved in the story, and we're going to talk about different aspects of characters later on. I think we'll talk about that in a much future video. We'll talk about the idea of protagonists and heroes and etc. Right? So the characters can be primary characters or heroes, and secondary characters and supporting roles, antagonists, protagonists, etc. Conflict, the challenge or problem around which the story is based, and that's an important one, right? That's an important one. There is some kind of conflict in a story, just like there is within game itself. Resolution is how the entire thing resolves. It's not always happy. Sometimes there's some sad endings, etc. But how is that conflict resolved? Point of view, who's telling the story and why? Style, what words are used and in what format is the story written? And tone, what mood or feeling does the narrative evoke in the reader? And again, for me, that's a really important one when it comes to game. The idea of tone is extremely important when it comes to game. I teach a second course all about cinematography in games, and cinematography in game is about the feeling or the mood that is being evoked within your player, right? As your player's playing your game, they're going to feel a certain way. We want them to feel a certain way. So the tone in which your story is told is of extreme importance. Dialogue, the talk between 2 or more characters. Actually, you know what? Now that I'm thinking about the sentence, it's probably wrong. You can have internal dialogue, you can have a soliloquy of some kind, and all of these things actually aid in the same thing it says here. Can help a reader to get to know the character or reveal the character's emotions and actions. Obviously, it doesn't require 2 people. A soliloquy will help a reader understand emotionally how someone's feeling. It puts into words how that character is actually feeling, right? So it doesn't have to be between 2 or more. It could be between just someone talking out loud. And lastly, symbolism, used to layer meaning within the narrative. So what does a black hat mean? What does a white hat mean? Again, in today's political climate, a lot of these things make sure you understand, even me using the word black hat and white hat is probably wrong, right? It's really important when you add in the symbolism that you understand where that symbolism comes from. A lot of the symbolism that we use has very negative connotations or comes from very negative roots. And I think it's really important that as we add symbols to games, or we add particular, underlying context to games that are driven home through symbolism, that we understand exactly where that symbolism comes from and exactly what we're supporting. It's difficult and it requires a lot of research, right? A symbol. There's entire courses on symbolism. We have entire courses on the idea of symbolism and what this means here at Centennial. So I really recommend that when you're adding symbolism to your game, you have a deep understanding of what it means. Okay, awesome. So those are the 11 elements of story that were listed across several different lists that I found in my research. All right. Not every story has all of these things. Some stories do, some stories don't. Some stories emphasize certain things, others don't. And that's why it's not included in every single list. Depending on what kind of story you're writing or what kind of narrative you're creating, you may or may not add certain aspects of it. So exactly how do all of these things come together? If we take a look at a standard plot diagram, which we're seeing right here, this is the normal rise in action that we can see throughout a narrative as it's being told. We're going to discuss later on how this is shown in games as well, because we're going to have a very similar method of this occurring within games. When we talk about the idea of hook, and we talk about the idea of beats within your game. Starts off with setting and characters. Settings and characters introduces the settings and characters, right? Where is everything taking place? Who is involved? A problem is introduced, We have a rise in action as the character is trying to deal with that problem. A climax occurs as that problem is finally dealt with. There's a falling off of action as we kind of tie everything together, and then the denouement, right, which is the ending and everything is kind of finalized within your story. We can divide this up into 3 acts. A typical 3-act structure goes something like this, with the first act being settings and characters, throughout the second act being the problem and dealing with the problem, and finally the falling action and the completion of your particular storyline. All right, so as I've mentioned, the first act introduces the main characters, the settings. It gives us a picture of what normal life is like. This is how things are before everything has gone awry, right? We understand the characters, we understand where we are, we understand the time period that we're in and everything else. It really is an introduction to what we're trying to say. Without this context, the problems will have very, very little meaning to us, or they may have very, very little meaning to us, depending on how we're doing it. There is a split when something different happens. Something occurs and a problem or a conflict suddenly arises. And our characters that we've been introduced to are then forced to kind of deal with that problem. And that brings us into our second act, right? The introduction of the conflict through the resolution of the conflict. It finally ends in the climax, and that's really where the climax kind of divides the second and the third acts. In the third acts, we have this new reality. How has everything changed? We're introduced to how the characters have changed, how everything has come to completion, right? And that is really the 3-act story. That's our 3-act story. It brings me to something that I really like to do whenever I'm creating a story or I'm trying to tell a story. It allows me really to simplify things. If we take a look at the 3-act structure, we can probably tell a story then in 3 sentences, right? This is an improv game. A long time ago, I was in an improv troupe. I used to do a show on Saturday nights in Montreal at Ernie Butler's Comedy Nest with a troupe called Without a Net. And we used to play this kind of game called a 3-sentence story. And in a 3-sentence story, it allows us to go through the entire narrative in just 3 simple sentences. The first sentence introduces the character, the second sentence introduces the conflict, and the third sentence resolves the conflict without negating any of the ideas that were already presented, right? That's really important. You don't want to be like the poorest of the narratives are like, oh, it was all a dream. You don't want to do that, right? You want to give the audience a satisfying ending to whatever narrative it is you're telling. So, first sentence introduces the character, second introduces the conflict, third ties everything up and resolves that conflict. So as an example, Luke, and I'm sure you guys, if I say this out loud, you guys are going to say, I know what that story is. Luke lives on the desert planet of Tatooine. That's my introduction. His life is ruined by the evil Empire. There's my problem. Luke joins the Rebel Alliance to fight the Empire's injustice. All right, and I by that 3 sentences alone, you know what story I'm telling here, or you should, if you're cool. You'll know exactly what story this is. All right, and a really great way, if you're looking for help in being able to create this 3-sentence story, is using the method of unfortunately and fortunately. So unfortunately can be used to introduce the conflict, and fortunately is how we're going to resolve that conflict. And like I said, this is a really great way of making a pitch. If you're making a pitch of your story, you want to include a pitch within your game pitch for an exec. You're trying to get some cash out of it. Having a 3-sentence story, this really high level 3-sentence story, is going to allow you to introduce your lore, introduce your main idea as far as narrative is concerned, without a long drawn out idea, right? A long drawn out story. You can include that as well, but having this 3-sentence story really kind of gives a high level view of the entire thing. So, Harry Potter is a young wizard. Unfortunately, Voldemort, the most powerful evil wizard, wants to kill Harry Potter. Fortunately, Harry has a number of wizard friends who work together to defeat Voldemort. All right, so again, I hope right away you see this and you understand what story I'm talking about here. Again, if you're cool, you know. If you're not cool, I'm sorry. Anyway, guys, we can see right away here, unfortunately, introduces our conflict. Voldemort's a powerful wizard who wants to kill Harry Potter, and fortunately ties everything together and gives us a resolution to that particular conflict. Awesome. If you want to make this, reduce this, I don't usually use this. In fact, it was a friend of mine, another professor, who really introduced to me the idea of the 1-sentence story, and he teaches 1-sentence story in his narrative class. I like the clarity of the 3-sentence story. Everything is right there. We can see the 3 acts very, very clearly. But in the same manner, you can use 1 sentence to create your entire narrative. Blank wants something, but blank, so blank. All right? And Filling in all those blanks, we have the introduction of the character and what they want. That want defines the objective of what the player is desiring, right? The spine of the character, what that character desires. But blank, and that blank then introduces the conflict. Something is standing in the character's way of getting what that character wants. Lastly, by the use of so, we can introduce the resolution and how the character goes about and gets that particular want that they have, right? And that is the one sentence story. Exactly the same thing. As an example, John wants ice cream, but he has no money to purchase any, so he robs a bank. All right? John has a desire for ice cream. The conflict is he has no money, but he robs a bank and he gets some cash out of it, right? I don't know if that resolves things, but it's a one sentence story. Okay. Lastly, we're going to talk about the hero's journey, because no introduction to narrative is an introduction to narrative without the use of the hero's journey. So let's talk about that for a few minutes. So Joseph Campbell, who came up with the idea of the hero's journey or the monomyth, he came up with this theory when he had explored numerous myths and stories and found there was kind of these common elements that occurred in all of the stories. And ultimately, there is a diagram that has been generated that demonstrates the hero's journey. Depending on where you look on the internet, there might be slightly different terminology utilized within this particular diagram, but it all kind of leads to the same thing. And rather than going through each stage of this diagram without any context, I think it's probably best to do so with some context in mind, just so you can see exactly where things are coming from and what they mean, right? Rather than just discussing it academically, we'll go into and we'll look at an actual film that kind of fits into this. And I think that one of the best ways to look at this is through Star Wars. And when I say Star Wars, I mean A New Hope, right? We're gonna pretend everything else didn't happen. And I know some of you guys out there, you guys are much younger than me, and for you, Star Wars was the the awesome clones and Jar Jar Binks and that kind of stuff. But for me, Star Wars really started with the first one I saw, which is A New Hope. So let's take a look at A New Hope and examine it as far as the hero's journey is concerned. The hero's journey is divided into two sections: the known and the unknown. And the known is really establishing a normalcy, right? This is the way things were before everything changes, right? The known. And in this, and when you take a look at Star Wars, we really examine Luke's ordinary world. We're gonna skip over the first section where we're introduced to Darth Vader and the capture of Princess Leia. That's the hook to our particular story, right? That's the hook to our particular story. We're going to skip over that for now, and we're going to really look at Luke and Luke's journey, Luke's hero's journey. Just know that Princess Leia has been captured by Darth Vader, and she is now being held captive on the Death Star. All right, so here we are. We're on Tatooine, and this is the known. This is Luke Skywalker, farmer, living on a desert planet, Tatooine. And he's really got this ordinary life, living with his aunt and uncle. Doesn't love his life. He's always looking out towards towards space, towards the horizon, and he wants to be a hero, right? He really does want to be this hero, and he's looking off into space, thinking like, wow, I wonder what it's like up there. And this is all the known stuff. We're really introduced to everything that sets our initial understanding of who Luke is, right? Where we have this introduction to who Luke Skywalker is. Now, at some point, there's a call to adventure, and that means that Luke is being called on. His life is going to be transformed in some way. Something occurs that is this initial call to adventure. And in the case of Star Wars, that call to adventure is really the purchase of R2-D2 and C-3PO. R2-D2 and C-3PO are droids who escaped Darth Vader when Leia was captured. And R2-D2 has this hidden message that Leia put inside of R2-D2 and is a call to Obi-Wan Kenobi to come and help her out, the last of the Jedi, supposedly. So Luke purchases R2-D2 and C-3PO. That's what he does. And he eventually, in this purchase, he eventually discovers this thing stuck inside of R2-D2. As he pulls on it, bam, this message comes up and says, hey, Obi-Wan Kenobi, you're our only hope. And Luke kind of realizes that Obi-Wan Kenobi might be old Ben Kenobi, who lives in the desert. He's a nomad who lives in the desert, or he's a hermit that lives in the desert. And Luke decides to bring these two droids, thinking maybe they're stolen, maybe they belong to Obi-Wan. He decides to bring these droids to Obi-Wan Kenobi. Now, at this point, we're really being introduced to a mentor, right? This is Luke's mentor. Obi-Wan is Luke's mentor, but we don't really know it yet. At this point in time, oftentimes within this call to adventure, there can be a loop back where the hero is a reluctant hero. They want to refuse this call to adventure. They don't want things to change. They don't want to get involved, right? And that's exactly what happens in this particular story. Luke brings the droids to Obi-Wan. Obi-Wan's like, yes, I'm the Jedi. Here's a lightsaber, blah, 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 blah. And Luke says, no way. I'm not getting involved in this. I have a good life here on Tatooine, living in the sand, right? This is what he says. So he kind of refuses this call to adventure at first. And it's not until Luke returns to his home and finds the farm burnt to the ground. Everything's been destroyed as the Empire is searching for these two droids. So Luke really has no choice. He's kind of this reluctant hero. He has no choice but to actually go with Obi-Wan. So that's kind of the refusing of the call. And that's when we really meet Obi-Wan as the mentor, and we understand that he's going to be there for Luke, right? He talks about how there's nothing Luke could have done, that, if he had been there, he'd just been killed anyway. And he really gives Luke the option of going with him. So at this point in time, we're ready to cross the threshold, right? We've gone past the known, and Luke has lost everything. He has nothing left that he knows, and he's really going to have to leave his known world and enter into this unknown world and start his hero's journey. We first do so when Luke leaves the burnt-out farm, and he's heading into the spaceport, and he meets a couple of his helpers. He meets Chewbacca, and he meets Han Solo. And Han Solo and Chewbacca are going to take him off Tatooine and take them onto the Millennium Falcon, etc., right? So these are two helpers that he meets. And along the way, as they're trying to rescue this princess offer of gold, we won't talk about the character types. We'll talk about this later on, the archetypes that are involved here. But the helper, Chewbacca and Han Solo, help in the trials and temptations and challenges that occur in picking up their next mentor, their next helper. That next helper is Leia, right? They are on the Death Star. There's an entire sequence within this film. It's very long, this particular sequence, where they are on the Death Star and they are trying to rescue Leia, right? That's their entire thing. This is the middle of the story now. They're moving into these challenges and temptations, and they're rescuing Leia. And they go through all this stuff, and they eventually get Leia off. Luke loses his mentor, Obi-Wan, or so we think. He loses his mentor, Obi-Wan, in a fight with Darth Vader, but R2-D2, C-3PO, Han, Leia, Chewbacca, and Luke all make it off and are ready now to stop the Death Star from destroying the Rebels' home, right? The Death Star's found the Rebels' home, and they're going to destroy it. And this is where this really big turnaround occurs, right? This transformation where Luke is now going to become the hero, right? So they've escaped the Death Star, and they are now moving out to try and stop the Death Star from destroying the Rebel planet. So they've gone through this entire thing. They are now rushing through the trench of the Death Star. There's this big fight that occurs. Luke sees one of his childhood friends die in this attack when they're trying to attack the Star and save the rebel planet, right? So it culminates in this kind of like this big rush down the trench, and we finally got this. We're moving in back into the known section. We're about to hit the reward section. This return. Luke goes in and he hears, use the Force, Luke. Everything looks like it's gone horribly bad. We have this return of his mentor, who helps him focus and use the Force to destroy the Death Star. Spoiler alert, Luke destroys the Death Star. So that brings us all the way back into the return. So everything has gone their way, everything has happened the way it should, and we are now have this return to normalcy where the Death Star is gone, the threat and everything is gone, and we had this final scene where Luke and Han Solo, not Chewbacca, for some reason, not Chewbacca, but Luke and Han Solo each get a medal, and they're rewarded this gift and this return to normalcy of Luke's new life, right? Things have changed. He's gone through this journey. He's changed in some way. He's evolved in some way. He's no longer this farmer on Tatooine. His normalcy is now, I am a rebel fighter. But he's now returned, and his final gift, or that final reward, is the scene in which he and Han get the medal. Not Chewbacca. Chewbacca does not get a medal. Not for Chewbacca. But everyone else gets a medal, all right? And that's our complete hero's journey. And if we take a look at pretty much any story, we're going to see this breakdown that occurs. It might be more obvious in some cases. And like I said, this particular diagram may change depending on the one you're looking for. Some of them have far more detail than what I've got here. This is a simplified version of the hero's journey diagram. But that being the case, it's most of our stories are going to kind of fall into this particular way of thinking. All right, guys, that's going to take us to the end of our introduction to narrative. It was a quickie, I think. Maybe I droned on a really long time. I don't know. But that takes us to the end of this introduction to narrative. We're going to take a look at a number of different things here. We're going to go in depth into conflict when we're exploring narrative here today as well. We're going to go into conflict because, again, conflict is a huge part of game, right? This entire idea of an objective and the players trying to get past particular conflicts is a big part of game. So we're going to really explore the idea of conflict. We're going to go back to narrative, and then we're really going to explore world building because that's what this is all about. This is all about world building. We're using this narrative to create our world in which our players are experiencing your game. Anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, let me know down below with a thumbs up. If you didn't, a thumbs down is perfectly fine. I love hearing from you, all right? I love comments. I like comments. I'd like to hear what you think about this particular way of study. Anyway, thumbs up, thumbs down, comments down below, and if you haven't done so, please take a few seconds to subscribe. Have yourselves a wonderful day, everyone.